this industry is very service-based by nature. Companies are typically used to having Big Four service firms be doing their testing for them. And the Big Four, they win their deals by building the most trust with companies.
How is Andera different than where the labs will be in their ability to service this market? Hi everyone, I'm Bucky Moore.
I'm Kat Zhang.
And this is the Investment Memo, the show where founders reveal the stories behind their businesses and how they will shape the future of their industries. Today, we're joined by Aryo Patel and Tinah, co-founders of Andera, the company building the AI-native platform to automate audit and financial assurance, starting with SOX control testing.
Aryo and Tinah are leading what we believe is an incredible team. They built their technology to achieve 100% coverage of SOX controls for the largest Fortune 500 companies. And today, they work with the most innovative internal audit teams at publicly traded companies to reimagine how audit work is done.
Today, we'll talk about why SOX automation is one of the biggest untapped enterprise AI opportunities, and how Andera built their complex technical architecture. Aryo, Tinah, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
So I'd love to hear more about your intuition for starting this company and why SOX control testing.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I will say, as a young founder entering this space, there's a lot of things that you kind of just have to go out on a whim and just hope you are correct about. But you also want to pair that with incredibly strong intuition for what problems you're initially tackling. So I guess the overarching belief that both Tinah and I had when we were entering the space was that AI would be incredibly transformative to audit risk and compliance tasks. So now, under this general framing, there are still many, many different places that you can move, like audit and compliance are two completely separate fields. But underneath this, we know that our goal is now to figure out what is the smallest niche that gives us the broadest of visibility into everything that's happening in this world. And it wasn't easy. We stumbled onto this on April 1st of 2024. It was until August 1st of 2024 when we first even heard about SOX after just calling hundreds of people in the profession. And then it took from August 1st of 2024 to October 1st to sort of build conviction that SOX was the wedge to start building in. From there, the rest kind of became history. Once you start hearing people describe their workflows, describe how mechanical and rote it tends to be, but also what nuances exist which make it so that it's not going to get automated away by the labs, everything just sort of clicked. And we just both had this intuitive feel at that point that SOX was the wedge to begin in.
And today, I think we're seeing this across the board, but just audit teams at large enterprises are some of the biggest adopters of AI, given their labor-intensive processes and enterprise-wide cutting cost initiatives. What have you guys seen, maybe for folks outside of the industry, could you talk about the significance of this transformation? What is the status quo today? And what does the process look like after Andera?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think maybe taking a step back is probably important to see what are people doing by hand and how has this process been the same since the past 40-ish years of doing audit. And it's effectively auditors looking at processes that are happening at a company, the data being so distributed and so different every single time that there's not been a good way to automate it step by step. And you end up with relatively intelligent people pulling pieces like payroll expenditures, Excels that just show general ledger reports, and having to manually reconcile numbers across vastly different documents. This has tended to escape automation even as audit standards continue to increase. So post-Sarbanes-Oxley becoming a thing in 2000, many companies tried to begin automating this with RPA or technologies of the day. The nuanceness of the data made it so much more profitable to just send this work to India as opposed to building automations in-house. We're now at sort of a crossroads here where the biggest bottleneck was the nuance of the data. And LLMs sort of unlock your ability to take one general sort of idea of data, which may express itself in 10 or 20 different ways, and not have to build 10 or 20 different automations around this. You can build something to generally parse all of this data. And this is sort of the change that auditors intuitively feel in their bones is good for their profession, just knowing how much they think it's a rote task. But they haven't been able to express it or build it beforehand. And this is really the first time in history that we've been able to do that.
One thing that I wanted to really hone in on here is, some of your customers have actually replaced their Big Four co-sourcing teams and handed you 100% of their SOX testing. That's a pretty remarkable proof point this early. Could you tell us a little bit more about, what goes into making these deals happen?
Yeah, it's a lot of trust building. I think this industry is very service-based by nature. Companies are typically used to having Big Four service firms be doing their testing for them. And the Big Four, they win their deals by building the most trust with companies. We've also hired industry veterans to help us build that trust and credibility within the market. And I think we've built so much trust that these customers are starting to even build case studies for us without us asking, which has been awesome for us and just very happy to see as founders.
What is it about AI that is shifting the market that may not have been successful in the past, and kind of the why now question?
It's a very multifaceted question, which makes it pretty interesting to answer. But you sort of have many, many competing forces here. One is that you have auditors that in their bones believe that a lot of this work should get automated, but maybe expressing how to do so is not immediately obvious. You then are now pairing this with the labs that are pushing the narrative that like, AI should be adopted more broadly, and like I'm 100% in agreement with that. Then you also have some even more nuanced pressure coming from audit committees, where if you have someone that's on the like audit committee or on the board of a public company, but also on the board of Google, there are some incentives to boost AI adoption. And you're kind of sitting in this perfect swarm right now where an industry that was typically very averse to trying out new things has this strong prior that AI will be very helpful to adopt. While we still need to prove a ton of value and there's a ton of trust that needs to get built with these clients, a large barrier to entering these companies beforehand has now been broken down, and is really just the product that now speaks for itself, in addition to how well you can service and help these customers build a perspective on what AI actually means for their organizations.
I've heard you tell us before that SOX data is a reflection of everything that's material to a business. I want you to elaborate on that a little bit. What does this data position actually let you see, and how does AI use change as you accumulate this judgment infrastructure?
SOX is one of the few places at a company that you actually get to map out their entire financial ecosystem. And what I mean by that is that what Sarbanes-Oxley is actually checking is that everything that is material to report revenue at the end of the day should be within 1% of accurate. Well, for me to check that, I have to look at everything that's material to the company. What's unique is that accounting doesn't get to see all this data. IT teams don't get to see this. Same with the compliance. Like effectively every other company sees a part of the entire story, but the auditors that actually look at the SOX data sees 100% of the story. And what this means is that we have some of the most talented auditors in the world on our team. If they see all this data, they can spend about like a few days to map out the entire financial ecosystem as a company. And when you start to look at higher order tasks, rather than just these like rote, monotonous tasks in SOX, and you start to move to higher value tasks in internal audit space, or even for work for the CFO, having this understanding for how the company functions as a whole is very, very important. What we're doing today on an engineering side to support that is, well, yes, we are servicing clients in the SOX domain and in other adjacent audit domains. Engineering work behind the scenes is focused on a much more broad objective of just interpreting out of distribution data at scale. And the thought is that, well, if we are starting in SOX, if we can actually start doing this from day one, fast forward 3-4 years, we'll have 3-4 years of actually building the right tech to automate decision-making for the CFOs at that point, rather than needing to pivot what we are doing 2 years down the line when we finally get access to the right data.
And then in terms of the 3 to 4 year vision for the company, what needs to be true about the product today before you deliberately go into those new adjacencies?
I think it all just comes down to how you parse and how you actually work with the data itself. And maybe just like a quick thought to how we actually do this right now. We try to make it so that actually answering the questions for SOX is very minimal reasoning efforts for the AI, because it's done all the hard work up front of digesting, understanding, and interpreting this data at like a very granular level. And the thought here is that like in the 3 to 4 year roadmap, we should just be improving the way that we interpret this data at scale, understanding all the nuances for how companies are putting this information together, such that we can keep productionizing it for use cases as you move upstream, but the same branch and core technology that you're building does not need to deviate too much. And by and large, this has seemed to be correct. It made us such that we had to spend a year and a half to actually get to market to build the tech in the first place. We're starting to see the fruits of the labor today, given that although we had only focused on getting Sarbanes-Oxley work automated, it also nicely blended into cybersecurity, into financial statements, lender due diligence, all things we'd never seen before. But because we were able to get the document interpretation at scale working well, it nicely generalized out, which gives us some belief that if we keep doing this for the next 3-4 years, as we go into higher order tasks, this will continue to hold true.
You know, in our discussions as part of our diligence, you guys mentioned that the real barrier is trust. How do you go about building credibility and trust among your potential customers?
Yeah, I think it was a difficult question early on. Of course, Aryo and I are young founders, and there weren't many software companies who had success selling an audit in the space. We made the choice early on that we knew from reading the market, from reading what Audit Board did, that auditors like selling to auditors, or they like talking to people who can speak their language. And so our first hire was an auditor. Our first few hires were people who were able to speak to customers, able to convince them that we will meet your SLAs and that we have the resources in order to make sure that nothing changes for your company and how they do their testing. So our team today is 50% auditors and 50% engineers. And I think as we continue to scale, the more case studies we build and the more people we partner with, especially the veterans, as in the Big Four or the big service firms, we build a lot more credibility by just building on the pillars of trust that they've been able to establish within the market already.
As I understand it, 2025 was about technology, building out the platform and proving it can scale. What were those details that were so important to get right, and how obvious were those decisions at the time versus being something you discovered through trial and error?
Maybe we can both take a stab at this answer, because I think it's pretty nuanced. I think there were some things that we took a bet on early on, started to immediately see payoffs, and just realized it was the correct thing to double down on. One example of this was the way that we actually parse Excels, where we built a custom engine to allow agents to get much more data visibility into how Excels are actually functioning under the hood and write much more complex features back to an Excel. This severely outshined anything that was done in the open source land, but there were sort of these questions constantly in the back of our minds, which is like, well, certainly its labs might want to do something similar. Maybe someone else comes out with a new open source library. Maybe we just haven't dug far enough in the internet to find someone that has already built this for us. We took a bet on ourselves to build this out. We started to see fruits of this like 4 months into it. And then ever since then, we've just been doubly investing. I think Tinah might be able to speak a little bit more to the agent side of things, where I think the story is a little bit different.
Yeah, I think from the start, we were very intentional with how we built our Excels. We knew that the data representation was the most important part for an agent. And we also knew that agent harnesses were going to change over time. What was optimal probably 2 years ago is definitely not the most optimal now, and we've actually rebuilt our harness multiple times over. I think the most principles that we kept from the start was that we knew models were going to change, the way they trained, the way they were being like post-trained would be changed. So we relied on what was most in distribution. So making sure that we shifted our agent to work most with code over time was a very like essential, I guess, like design decision we made pretty early on. And ever since then, we've just been looking at how models have been trained and how do we make sure that our agents work best such that the work they do is most in distribution with how they were trained.
And given this technical depth, like what does the customer see when they run Andera side by side with one of your competitors? When is that moment that this becomes clear in terms of the experience that they have in the product?
Generalization out to other tasks that are not SOX or on your most complicated SOX controls. I think the trade-off that we made was that we're okay with slower processing time if that means you can just handle much more complex problems. And that kind of goes back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, where our focus is on data interpretation. So you can really think of any task kind of functioning in two phases. First is interpret what's happening in the data, and second, answer your very specific questions about SOX. And certainly it would be faster if we just answered your specific questions about SOX on day one, but you actually missed a lot of nuance, and like potentially you could actually just like answer incorrectly if you end up doing that. Not to mention the fact that this is like misaligned with our end goal of data interpretation at scale. Now, typically this would be a problem if you're just doing simple things like make sure the names on two documents match. You don't need to do a lot of complex work for that. But you're trying to really understand like how like software capitalization worked at this company, why it's different this year than it was in the past, and really piece together a story that ties many, many different business units together. That is the time where we shine, and other competitors are like still catching up, frankly. You can kind of see like customers' eyes kind of like light up when it gets a control that would have previously taken them like 2 weeks to do, but now it's getting done in just like a few hours instead.
I'll also say, I guess, due to the fact that we have so many auditors on the team, we were able to understand how SOX differs at scales, the types of controls that exist, and then how they differ across other types of verticals like financial audits and operational audits. And so I think we built our agent early on to make sure it was as generalizable as possible. I think other people in the industry, they start to hard code certain rules for certain, I guess, like sets of controls, and we find that to be very unscalable over time. And so we've seen for our customers, they've gone ahead and started pitching to other directors within their audit teams, just saying like, oh, I think this tool could help you as well. And we found that other teams who we've never even knew existed before we started building for SOX are having a really good time using the tool as well and spreading it to other people within their departments.
So to state the obvious, the models keep getting better and the labs continue to move up the stack and try to verticalize their solutions. I'm sure every customer you talk to, every potential candidate you speak with is asking the same question, like how is Andera different than where the labs will be in their ability to service this market? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's two thoughts. First is a thought on like what does model improvements actually mean for the task at hand? And the second is like what is the supporting interface that you need around the model to actually accomplish the task that you have? So like let's just start with like the models themselves. This real bottleneck is search and exploration over the data that we have. We have started to notice that it's probably unlikely that context lengths are going to scale to the extremes that we need it to in such a short amount of time, which generally means that a model in and of itself is not going to be able to like answer audits, like SOX audits on their own, not to mention the higher order tasks that we want to be able to solve in the future too. Now, there's like a second point on top of this, which is like, okay, well, if a model can't do it by itself, what about like a generalized agent that some of these companies build? Surely they're going to be working on generalized agents for Excel. We've already seen a bunch of generalized coding agents come out. And this is where the specificity of audit and the fact that it is a judgment-based problem really, really shines through. We noticed that when we start to use like off-the-shelf harnesses like Claude Code or like Codex harnesses, there's certain design decisions that are not purpose-built for audit. For instance, we might need to do certain things in the way that we handle compaction. We might need to do certain things in the way that we handle memory. And the degree of specificity that we need to apply to every single task really feels like you have to make a custom-built harness specifically for audits, just given the amount of judgment and reasoning that is on each problem. Through both of those lenses, it very much so feels that when a new model comes out, we just don't notice that much change in our evals. Like maybe they go up by like 1% or 2%, but it's nothing like breakthrough, nothing astronomical, even when these models are supposedly like post-trained for parsing Excels. And I guess like generally out of this, it just makes me feel safer at the end of the day that the work that we are doing right now is relatively orthogonal to the work that the labs are doing, but in the direction that our clients need to see to actually get value out of these models.
Let's look a little bit on the existing incumbents. So the Big Four, they collectively employ 1.5 million people annually and audit a majority of the publicly traded companies today. How do you see the audit firms like the Big Four adapting to the market, and how does Andera fit in this space?
Yeah, I think in the space, they probably have the most complex question to answer. For us, by comparison, we have a very easy goal. Like our mantra is just build the best tech, hire the best sales team, and then go conquer the market. If they do that exact same playbook, they're just going to cannibalize their entire business. That doesn't mean that they can just bury their heads in the sand and ignore this problem. They have to be very proactive and start fighting this head on. We've seen this manifest itself in 2 ways. Like first is they're just partnering with some of the biggest labs. So I believe KPMG had a public announcement that they're partnering with Anthropic. EY is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on an internal tool as well, which I think they've made a public announcement about too. And this is all to make sure that if they are getting tech, at least there's a chance that it's like internal so they can control its distribution and control how it actually affects the margins themselves. At the same time, they're also having conversations about how we should actually rebalance headcounts. Like, what does it actually mean for offshore, which is the way that things were run from about 2008 till now? What does it actually mean for the profession if we need to start moving away from that and more towards an AI-first testing lens? Now, it's not as simple as firing people. If you start to do that, you're going to necessarily need to reduce top-line revenue, which is something you want to maintain. As a way to navigate around this, they're also trying to figure out if there's ways they can offer additional services, given that they're freeing up more hours if they're using AI for testing. And across this entire mess, I think they've also realized that it probably makes sense to start involving startups too, where we might have some perspective on how the deployments would work. We can control the rate at which we deploy with them, and we can sort of help them through this transition. Certainly in an AI-first world, there is always a place for the Big Four. They're a pillar of trust and like absolutely essential for the US economy to be working the way it is. I think we're just here to make sure we can help them on this journey.
And maybe just switching gears a little bit here, a little walk down memory lane. We met a little more than over a year and a half ago. And then we started kind of spending time together. And as of, early this year, at the time, you guys weren't necessarily thinking about raising until the latter half of 2026. What convinced you to accelerate the timeline?
There's a few different things. One is that I think we were surprised by how well the tech generalized. We didn't realize that on Jan 1st of 2026, we'd be able to just do cyber having never tested it before, or same with AML or like KYC. And you sort of had these like very pivotal moments at the company where it's like, okay, our lead relative to competition is like never going to stay constant. It's going to like ebb, it's going to flow. It's as we continue on our journey to build a great company. But like right now, it certainly felt like our lead, at least on a tech front relative to our competitors, was larger than we'd seen before. And this excited us for two reasons. Like one is, of course, like it's our time to like claim the market. And the second, it meant that our generalized direction that we were going on beforehand was correct. If both of those things were true and the market is heating up and there's Big Four pressure that they're also trying to build their own AI tools, it really started to feel like time was of the essence. So in that mindset, once we started to piece all those variables together, like waiting did not really make too much sense. And of course, when you see great partners come through the door, there's like no reason to not work with them.
So when it comes to Andera's long-term vision of becoming the AI audit brain that makes judgment calls across a company's full financial ecosystem, like what really has to go right for this to become reality over the coming years?
There's like a few things. One is like, there has to be this perception that Andera continues to build, that this is probably one of the hardest problems to work on in AI space right now. In particular, when you're working on like coding problems or with coding agents, you naturally benefit from the models being aggressively post-trained on these tasks. Unfortunately, you don't really get this too much in the Excel domain. And even on the tasks that they are post-trained on, they significantly lack in complexity relative to the real-world Excel interpretation tasks that we need to solve. Marrying that with the fact that it's working in audit is once this is overcome and we're able to bring in like the best researchers to start working on this problem, I think data interpretation at scale will be much more crackable. Now, the second thing, I think Tinah was alluding to this as well. Big Four has spent hundreds of years building up trust in the market. We're looking to do that in like a few short years instead. And I think making sure that you're able to build a trusted reputation to have the most complex financial data at your fingertips is an ongoing challenge. To be clear, I think like we've put things in motion to solve both of these in terms of partnering with the most senior and most trusted people in the industry who are willing, as a great honor to us, they're like willing to put their name behind the Andera tool itself. Nevertheless, whenever you're trying to speedrun trust, it's like always a difficult thing to do.
Aryo, Tinah, appreciate you both being here. And on behalf of CAD and the rest of our partners at Lightspeed, we're super excited to be your partner and to build this company together.
The excitement is all ours. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.